All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Orchid Workshop for Researchers. Again, I'm Paulo Guhilde. I'm the strategist for the Orchid US community. My colleague Kayla Rumhit, our program assistant, is also on the call today. So feel free to ask any questions that you have via chat, and we will answer them in the chat or perhaps later during our Q&A. So our agenda for today is we're going to go through about just kind of an overview of what is ORCID. We'll also talk about the benefits of ORCID. And of course, we'll go through some how-tos. So basically looking at how to populate your ORCID record. And in the end, we'll have time for questions and discussions. So feel free to ask any questions then, or feel free to go ahead and add your questions on the chat, and we will answer them towards the end of our session. All right, so before we completely start the workshop, please, if you have time, please respond to these questions via chat. So, what are some of the challenges or barriers that you are encountering with ORCID? So, we'll take just a few moments and see what you all are, if there are any issues that you're encountering with ORCID. And Kayla just shared the question via chat as well. Great, that's great, Sam. Looking at how to add previous publications perhaps and which ones auto update in ORCID. That's great. Any other ones? Great. Thank you, Nancy. Wonderful. Any others? Great. Humanities fields. Yes, always a good question. ORCID support for humanities. Wonderful. Yeah, keep them rolling if you have any other things that you would like to add. But yes, we will definitely go through a lot of this things that you all are talking about and some of the challenges and the barriers that you are encountering with ORCID. And we will also share some resources that will be helpful for you. And if there are any things that we can't answer right now or today, um, feel you can always reach us at orchidus@lyrasis.org and we will follow up with you. All right, so let's go ahead and start our workshop. Kind of get us going here. All right. So, what is ORCID? So, ORCID stands for the Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. So, it's the good thing here to kind of remind is open researcher, right? So it's open to everyone. And it's not just for researcher as well. It's all contributors in ORCID or in the research process. So the ORCID provides free unique identifiers for researchers. So what you'll see here on our screen is we have a volunteer researcher, Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, and we can see her ORCID ID. And this is sort of like the things that we are quite familiar with, the ORCID ID. So that's the 16-digit ORCID identifier or unique identifier that's basically a set of numbers for you as a researcher. And it looks like a link. And that's because it is a link. It takes you to what we are calling an ORCID record or sort of like an online CV. So something that you all are familiar with, especially in your fields, right? So this is an online CV, which is what we're calling an ORCID record. And it has information about your employment, education and qualifications, your professional activities. So professional activities are memberships, service, distinction, and invited positions. You can also add information about your funding, so funding that you have received. We also have information about research resources. Now, research resources here are things that you probably have received when, let's say, you used a national laboratory equipment, for example, or certain libraries or library and rare books collections. So those are research resources, and organizations can actually push that to your ORCID record if they are set up for it. There's also a section for works. Works here is basically encompassing a lot of products that you have that you produce as a researcher. So that could be your publications, that could be your um, images that you've produced, or it could be a data set, or perhaps a book chapter. So all of those things are works, and that's kind of a big part of ORCID here. We also have a peer review section, and this is looking at your peer review activities. So, for example, you're a reviewer for a journal. So, if that particular publisher or journal is set up to push something to your ORCID record, they can push a peer review activity to your ORCID record. So, letting everyone know that you are a peer reviewer for this particular journal. Keep in mind that this does not identify which particular journal issue it is, but rather it will only identify that you are a peer reviewer for a journal. And that's a good thing because especially with blind reviews, that's important to think of. All right. And this kind of answers the questions about the humanities field as well. So a lot of us, and you're probably kind of familiar with this previously, where ORCID has a lot on, a perception that it's mainly for, say, STEM, STEM fields, for example. But lately, ORCID has been really working hard in kind of making sure that the humanities are represented in this area as well. So new work types have come out this year, and that's adding work types for humanities field, adding work types for, say, an artistic output for images, musical compositions, or even teaching materials. So those things are available now in ORCID, so you can actually add more of the work, more of the products that you have produced as a researcher or as an academic in the area to kind of put all of this information here. Yes, Angela, good question. So, would this include news interview? Yes, there's actually a section here as well for that kind of product that you have produced. So, there's a news interview. If you were interviewed by a news, for example, as an expert. So there's that section here as well. So we can go through more on this later on during the Q&A. Maybe take a look at an example of the different areas in this work types. But definitely there are more work types that are available now in ORCID for you as a researcher to add what the products you have produced. Okay, so now ORCID really, if you think about it in the research landscape, so as a researcher, for example, you go through, you basically work at an organization. So you work with your employer, right? And then perhaps when you are a researcher, you are a faculty, a researcher in an organization, you will apply for a funding. So you'll go to a funding organization, apply for an NIH grant, perhaps or perhaps to a private funder, could be an American Heart Association, all of those things. And then once you produce all of the products, you've done your research, the data, and all of these things, you will publish your work as well. So all of this is really what kind of available for you, especially with ORCID. So the flow of ORCID in the research landscape is really important here. So you have a unique identifier as a researcher, your ORCID ID. You can use that to connect with your employer, use your ORCID ID perhaps to go apply for a funding grant, and then you can also use your ORCID ID number when you publish. When you publish your article, the results of all the things that you're doing. So all of this are kind of interconnected and basically make this as an information about you as a researcher. So you can make connections with different organizations, such as your employer, an organization such as a funder, or perhaps a publisher. So all of these are interconnected, and you're able to use your ORCID ID to make that to make you as part of the research landscapes as much as possible. And if you don't have an ORCID ID yet, it takes only less than 60 seconds to register for one. So you can go to orchid.org/register and register for an ORCID ID. So you can get your ORCID ID there, right there and then. So it's fairly easy process. We can go through this process at a later time if you have any questions about how to register. If not, there's also additional how-tos on this slide deck that you can use when you're doing when you want to register for an ORCID ID. All right. So now that we kind of gotten a little bit of an overview of ORCID, let's talk a little bit more about the benefits of ORCID. So the benefits of ORCID in the entire research landscape. Okay. So ORCID distinguishes you as a researcher, as an individual. It also persists over time. So that unique identifier, that's a persistent identifier, and it persists over time. It also bolster your digital identity, and it can also meet funder, publisher, and reporting requirements. So depending on the organization that you work with. And ultimately, all of this is really to save you time. So you don't have to fill out forms. You don't have to, you know, do everything for your reporting. All of this is available in ORCID that you can basically connect with different systems. And we can go through this one by one here. All right. So the first thing is that it really distinguishes you as a researcher. So we all are probably familiar with this, especially for a lot of us that may have very common names, right? So we have the same last names, perhaps the same initials. So all of those things can be a little bit difficult sometimes to distinguish who is who. So you can kind of see that in this list of authors for this particular article. So the same last name, the same um, initials. So we don't really know which one is the author that you're looking for. So having that ORCID ID distinguishes you from from another researcher. It also distinguish yourself over time. So it persists over time. So here you can kind of see the different versions of Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia's name. And I do this too. Like I've done this before where I use my full name. Sometimes I use my middle initials. Sometimes it would just be my first name and my last name. So all of this can be connected within ORCID. So it identifies you, for example, that you are this author using this different um, names all throughout. So it really connects you and persists that over time. It also bolster your digital identity. So here you'll see sort of like a list of authors with their ORCID icon next to it. If you click on that ORCID icon, it will take you to that person's or to that author's ORCID record. So it really bolster your digital identity here. So that way you can kind of see, you can look at what this author has done. So where they work at, what education they've received, publications that they have published, or funding that they have received. All of those things or informations are there as well. So it really makes it um, easy for you to share and reuse the data that's available there. Also making connections with other researchers, as well as getting recognition for the work that you have done. So the publishing that you have done, the research that you have done. So getting all of that recognition for yourself as a researcher. It also meet requirements, all right? So requirements from funders, for example. So these are just a list of funders right now that are requiring ORCID IDs. So American Heart Association, for example, um, Wellcome Trust, Children's Tumor Foundation. So all of these funders are requiring ORCID IDs from their investigators. And having one, of course, meets that requirement. So one of the things that is coming up this coming May 25th, 2025, NIH is going to require persistent identifier, which is really ORCID in this sense, um, basically ORCID is being required for all senior and key personnel. So you have to have an ORCID ID to be able to apply for an NIH funding. And you can also use your ORCID ID to in Science CV as well. So that way you can create bio sketches out of the data or the information that you have in your ORCID record and create a bio sketches out of that. So we can show you that at the later during the Q&A later if you have any questions about specific things about how bio sketches works and ORCID. It also meet requirements for publishers. So a lot of publishers now are also requiring ORCID IDs in their workflows. So when you submit a manuscript, for example, publishers are probably asking for your ORCID ID, or they want you to log in or connect your ORCID ID in their system. So all of those things are important here. So for example, you have Springer Nature, Wiley, IEEE, all of them are requiring ORCID IDs in their workflows. So when you submit an ORCID, when you submit a manuscript, they'll probably ask for those information from you. And this is important because it will make it possible. If they're going to ask for an ORCID ID, you definitely want to share it with them. A big part of that is most likely, and a lot of publishers are doing this, is that they can add your ORCID ID in the DOI metadata of your publication. So when that publication is officially comes out or being published, it can get automatically added to your ORCID record. And so basically, publishers will push it to Crossref, which is a search and link wizard in ORCID, and I'll show you that later on and how to make that connection. And then Crossref will push it directly to your ORCID record. So that way you don't have to enter the information in ORCID yourself. So that's an easy way to make sort of like an auto update to your ORCID record. And of course, research organizations are working with ORCID as well, or requiring ORCID, or asking for your ORCID ID, or wanting you to have an ORCID ID, so encouraging you to have one. So a lot of research organizations are now integrated with ORCID. So these are some of our members actually here in the ORCID US community that are having connections with ORCID or integrations with ORCID. So you have Emory University, for example, or North Carolina State University, Stanford University, and RTI International. So these are research organizations um, that are working, that are integrating with ORCID, and then having their researchers make that connections with their organizations. And they're doing this mainly, a big part of this, especially for universities, is to help you with reporting, right? So towards the end of the school year, perhaps, or the fiscal year, they want you to, um, compile all the publications that you've done. So you can make that um, reporting easier by pulling the information from your ORCID record and pushing it perhaps to your reporting system at the organization. So it could be a faculty 180 or digital measures, for example. And all of this is really to save you time as a researcher. So what you're seeing here in this kind of graphic is that the researcher is at the center of the entire kind of ORCID universe here, right? So as a researcher, you can make a connection or connect with employer, and your employer can collect information about you, sort of like your publications. And then you can also make connections with your funding or your funders. And then the same thing is having that funders to be able to collect or gather the information about your publications, perhaps, or funding that you may have received before. And that's the same thing with publisher as well. So there's a lot of interoperability here, is that making sure that the data is flowing in and out between these different systems. So it really kind of makes it possible for you to share the information that you have in your in your ORCID record, and for your organizations that you work with to gather those information, and for them to also push information into your ORCID record. So this is the idea of sort of enter once and reuse often. So the idea that you are entering the data once and that different organizations can reuse those data uh, when especially to meet requirements, for example. All right. So now that we kind of got to see a little bit of what the benefits are of using ORCID, now let's go through more on how to populate your ORCID record. You know, it's one thing to have an ORCID ID. It's great to have that, but it's even better if you're populating your ORCID record, right? Because if you're just going to leave it blank, it's not going to be useful at all for anyone. So you're not going to be sharing your data. Organizations are not going to be able to gather those information from about you as a researcher. So it's not going to be useful unless you populate your ORCID record. So now we're just going to go through how you can do that. So the different kind of how-tos that might be possible to make it easier for you as a researcher to work with ORCID. All right, so adding information to the ORCID record. So there are different ways that you can do that. And again, kind of just want to recap a little bit on the different areas of ORCID. So um, the information that you can add to, for example, you have the biographical information, employment, education qualifications, invited positions and distinctions, memberships and service, funding, and works. Now, the last two here, peer review and research resources, are only available by organizations. So only organizations are able to push that information into somebody's ORCID record. So it has to be the organization that you trusted pushing that data to your ORCID record. Okay, so how can we add information to our ORCID record? So there are different ways that we can do that. The first one, of course, is a manual entry, and this is a manual entry by you. Or a manual entry by a trusted individual, for example. We can show you how we can work with a trusted individual later on. But there's also a way where we could use a search and link wizard. And this is more of something easier, an easy way to kind of gather the uh, previous works that you've done or previous funding that you have received and have it populated in your ORCID record. And of course, there's organizations pushing data to your ORCID record. So they are automatically pushing that information to your ORCID record. So those are just the different ways that information are added to an ORCID record. All right, so let's kind of go through a little bit in this different kind of methods of adding information to ORCID. So this is an example of a manual entry. So you as an individual can manually enter information to ORCID, or it could be a trusted individual can add information to your ORCID record. So this example is about on adding employment information into your ORCID record. So one of the things that you really want to do here, if you're adding it manually, is when you start typing in the organization name, is to actually use that drop-down pre-populated kind of menu, or that's what's available there. So it could be, let's say, if I start with University of Illinois, for example, I can pick which organization I go to. So here, um, all right, so there's a question about where can I click to get here. So if your ORCID record, when you log in, you go to your employment, and then there should be an ways to add. There's an add kind of plus, add there, and then you add it manually or a manual addition. You can see that, and I'll show you that later on if you have any questions on how to do that. So you can start typing in your organization. So let's say University of Illinois. And then I would click on University of Illinois System, or it could be University of Illinois at Chicago. So the organization that you work with. So once you click on that, make sure you choose the ones that's the organization that you are currently employed or that you were previously employed at. And then the other ways that you can also add manual entry in this section, the same idea, the same kind of process is that you can do the same thing for education, for qualification, invited positions, distinctions, memberships, and service. So these are just the areas where you can manually enter information. So that's going to be kind of the key things. So those are your affiliations information in the ORCID record. Now, a search and link wizard kind of works differently. The search and link wizard is only available in the work section or and also in the funding section. So I will show you both. The first one, it's in the work section. So when you're adding works or your publications, for example, this is the same way, like, when you were adding employment, you click on that plus button or that icon that says add, and then you can click on this particular example, the search and link wizard, click on search and link wizard. So essentially, search and link wizards are built-in kind of like databases in ORCID. So when you're adding publications in ORCID, there are a list of search and link wizards that you can use to add information or to add publications or works into your ORCID record. So here's an example of that. Click on search and link wizards, and this is a list of search and link wizards that's available in ORCID. So it could be cross-ref metadata search, for example, could be data sites for data sets that's available out there. There's also Europe PubMed Central. Actually, PubMed articles or the PubMed information or articles that you have is also available in Europe PubMed. So you can actually use that as well. So these are just some of the search and link wizards that's available for you. So an example here that we're going to go through is the Crossref metadata search. Crossref metadata search is essentially a lot of publishers use this with Crossref to push their publications, and that can be added to your ORCID record. So when you click on Crossref metadata search, it will ask you to authorize. So basically, authorization means that they're asking you to basically give them permission to add or update information in your ORCID record. So basically updating your work section, for example. So when you do this, you want to authorize organizations. So that way they can actually push that data into your ORCID record. So they can update your ORCID record here. So click authorize access. Once you do that, you will then take you to the Crossref database. Within this Crossref metadata search, you can then search for your name, for example, or you can search by DOI or a title of the article. Sometimes it's easier to just search for your name, especially if you have multiple articles out there. So search for your name here, and all of the articles that have your name will pop up. You can then go ahead and add that particular article to your ORCID record. So an example here, so that first article here for Sheila Raven, you can click on add to ORCID. So when you do that, that particular citation will automatically get pushed to your ORCID record. So it gets added to your ORCID record. And once it's added to your ORCID record, it will then pop up or show up in your ORCID record with this information here. So you'll have the article name, the title, for example, the DOIs, all of those metadata. But one thing to kind of take a look at is that source down at below at the bottom of that particular entry. So it says Sheila Raven via Crossref metadata search. So that means that you as a researcher added that information via this particular search and link wizard. So via Crossref metadata search. So this is a way for you essentially that you are claiming your article from that particular database and pushing it here. Essentially, a lot of search and link wizard link wizards works fairly similar to this kind of workflow. So it really depends on how that particular database is being set up. But essentially, what you're doing is you're giving them, you want to give them the authorization, the permission to make changes to your ORCID record. So that way you can either claim the data or claim the article, the citation to your ORCID record, or eventually they can push it automatically to your ORCID record. And this one is an example of a search and link wizard in the funding section of ORCID. So if you have a funding, previous funding that you have received, for example, you can go to the funding section and click on search and link. And when you do that, there's only one option really here, and this is Dimensions Wizard. So Dimensions Wizard is a search and link wizard specifically for funding information. So not all funding, however, are available here, but you can search again for your name and see what's available for you and see if there's your funding agency have added the information is here or not. If they're not here, you can always add your funding information manually as well. All right. So now the other option or the other ways that information are populated in your ORCID record is automatically via trusted organizations. So trusted organizations are what we're calling organizations that are basically have an ORCID integration, and that you will then give them authorization, permission to update your data or to update your ORCID record. So it could be a university, for example, updating employment information in your ORCID record, or it could be a funding agency adding funding information in the funding section of ORCID. So it works the same way as what we have seen with the search and link wizard. You would make the connection with your trusted organization. So you make that connection with the university, for example, connecting your ORCID ID with the university or connecting your ORCID ID with the funding agency. You make that authorization. And once you authorize them, they would then become a trusted party or a trusted organization in your ORCID record. So what you see here on my screen are basically a screenshot of the trusted parties that me as a person, as an individual, as a researcher have given permission to these organizations to update my ORCID record. So you can see here that I have Crossref metadata search. I've also given permission to DataCite and Dimensions was Wizard, and I've also have given permission that you're probably not seeing here to my employer, Lyricist, to update information in my ORCID record. So all of these trusted organizations that you have given permissions to make changes to your ORCID record. So depending on how they are set up and how their integration is set up, they can um, add information to your ORCID record. So it could be like a publication, like data site here. So all of these are publications. So they when become trusted organizations, they can push that data to your ORCID record. So just keep that in mind as well. And there are also, once organizations have pushed data to your ORCID record, you will probably see this, that kind of check mark in your ORCID record, right? So the green check mark. And those are what we are calling trust markers. So there's a little bit more additional credibility and validity to that particular um, for that particular item in your ORCID record, because we know that this organization pushed it to your ORCID record. So it's essentially giving it a little bit more of validity that, yes, this is your publication, or that you worked here, that you are an employee of this organization. You will also see that in the verified email domains as well. So if you are using your um, email domain, for example, for your employer. So it could be like a .edu, for example. An example here with lyrasis.org, I'm using a verified email domain. So you will see that there's that green check mark as well. So that's adding a little bit more of uh, trust marker to my ORCID record. And you will also see down here on my name, that you'll see the employment information, for example, added by my employer, Lyrasis. So my employer, for example, basically push that data into my ORCID record. So just giving it a little bit more of validity that, yes, I actually do work at Lyrasis. So this kind of information are what we're calling a trust marker in your ORCID record. So now a lot of this information goes into your ORCID record. One thing to keep in mind that you as an individual, as a researcher, you do have full control of your ORCID record. So the full control means that you can control pretty much every piece of that information in your ORCID record. So you could either change the visibility setting of your ORCID record, the entire ORCID record, to either publicly available or trusted organizations. Trusted organizations means, again, just the organization that you've given permissions to. And you can also change it to only me, and that means it's completely private. So it could be your record could be completely private. It's only available to you. It doesn't make sense as much to make it completely private because you do want to share those information that's available in your ORCID record. So if no other organizations can access it, it's not going to be as helpful as it should be. So you can always recommend to make it publicly available or make it trusted organizations only. Um, so like I said, you can control it, change it to the entire record to be just with this kind of options, or you can also change the visibility setting of each section of your or each entry of your ORCID record. So if you want to change, say, a particular employment information to just trusted organizations only, you can do that and have the other employment information publicly available. So you can pretty much control each item in your ORCID record. So things to keep in mind is that um, we encourage you to use your ORCID ID wherever possible. When you're probably working with different organizations, you will most likely see this green ORCID ID button or this icon, for example. When you see that, that pretty much kind of like prompts you that ORCID is available within that system. So I encourage you to make that connection as much as possible, making the connection with your funding organization, for example, making the connections with your university, or making a ORCID connection with your publisher. So all of those things are kind of available out there. And there's that idea of interoperability to make it easier for you. So just keep that in mind. So if you see the green ORCID ID icon, that pretty much means that there's some sort of ORCID connection that's available there. All right, so we're pretty much at the tail end of our workshop here. So I just want to point out that there are in this slide deck, we will share this with you all. So don't worry too much about the links that we're sharing, information that's kind of what you're seeing on the screen. So we will share this slide deck with you. You can click on any of this information here or these links that takes you to the different how-to sections of ORCID. Um, whether you want to create an ORCID ID or adding funding information, all of those things are available here. All right. So before we get into our Q&A, if you want to answer this question, please feel free to do so via chat. So just kind of the idea of what are some of your takeaways from this presentation. I'll give you all a few minutes while I kind of scroll on the chat and see what questions we should be answering right now.
Hey, Paolo.
Yes,
Um,
Kayla.
While everyone is answering this question in the chat, there were a few questions from people about how to add like employment works funding to your ORCID record. Is it possible for us to share your screen and walk through step by step that process in the ORCID
We
record for them?
we can certainly do that. So let me go ahead and stop sharing and pull up my ORCID record for you all. Okay, hold on a minute. All right, so I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen right now, and hopefully you all can see this. And I'm getting quite a lot of glare from the sun right now, so hopefully everything works well. All right, so can everyone see my screen? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you, Caleb. All right, so this is my ORCID record. Um, what you'll see here is basically the different sections of ORCID. So let me just kind of scroll down a little bit here. So you will also see sort of pencil icons here on each sections of ORCID. So that means that you can make changes to those areas. So just click on those icons. So let me scroll down a little on adding an employment information. So here's my employment section in my ORCID record. You can click on the add button here, that plus icon. Let me hold on a minute. Okay, so here it will pop up right away to add employment in your ORCID record. So this means that you're adding an employment record in your ORCID record manually. So for example, what would be a good one here? Let's just do my current work, right, at Lyricist. So I can search for lyricists, and then there should be sort of like suggested um, organizations that will pop up. So you have lyricists here. So let's say if you do that, and let's say I'll do University of Illinois. So if I worked at um, I used to work at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So if I do that here, I could go ahead and add that information. So I would say University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and then add the information that's kind of required here. So it could be the city. But since you've already actually clicked Urbana-Champaign, the city should be automatically populated as well as the country information should be populated already. And then there's an employment details. So this is where you can add additional information to your employment. So it could be like the department. So I'd say I work at the Department of Anthropology, for example. So I can put that information, the role and title that you've held, the start date, and the end date if you have left the organization already. So all of this kind of details are available here, and you can add those information. There's also a section here about visibility. So you can change, like we mentioned earlier, that you can change the visibility of each entry in the ORCID record. So if I just want to make this trusted parties only, I can do that. So you can make those changes here. So that's sort of like a manual entry in your ORCID record. Yeah. Kayla, what was the other portion of that question? So we have
Th
employment funding, right?
yes, one person did ask about funding, but very quickly,
Mhm.
do you mind showing us how to get to the ORCID record itself?
Oh, yeah, of course. So let me sign out here. All right, so you go to orchid.org, and then in the top right section, you'll see sign in or slash register. Just click on that, and then enter your ORCID credentials here, and just click sign in. That should take you to your ORCID record. Um, if you have not registered for one, when you actually um, click on that sign in button. It will take you to this login page. You can just click on register now to register an ORCID ID. So that should be an easy way to do that. All right. And I think the funding section, correct? Let's take a look at
Yes,
that.
we did have a question about how to add funding.
Okay. All right. Let's go back here. So add funding. Um, so go scroll down to that funding section. So funding section, I have not received any funding, so that's empty right now, but you can add funding here. So there are two ways that you can add funding. One is manual entry. So that means you have to enter the information where you received it, what kind of funding you received. So it could be a grant, for example, what's funding subtype, the project, all of those information that they're asking here. Um, you can go ahead and fill that out. You can also use a search and link wizard, which we mentioned earlier, which is what we're calling dimensions wizard. You just click on dimensions wizard, make sure you authorize them. This will probably automatically send me here because I have already given them the authorization. But if I have not, it will take you to the ORCID login page basically to authorize this particular search and link wizard. And here you can search for your name for funding information. You can also search for the grant title if you like. Um, so let's say if I do a library, these are not my grants, but you can, let's say, for example, you can go ahead and add that. So scroll down. Let me see. It's quite a lot of information here. Okay. So yeah, so you could go ahead and click on that. Um, council, and then all the way to the bottom of this, there's a next button. You can click on that and you can have this added to your ORCID record that says submit to ORCID. So that's a way for you to add funding information using the dimensions wizard. Now keep in mind that not all funding information are available here. It's only certain agencies or certain funding agencies are available in this dimensions wizard. I'll go ahead and remove that because that's not my funding info. All right. What other questions do we have? Let's see.
We did have one question. Do you know why a
Mhm.
university employer might show up as a verified email domain but doesn't show up as a trusted organization? Didn't know if you wanted to share that answer.
Correct. That's a good question. So, a university domain could be a trusted domain or a trusted, um, let me see. That's a really good question here. Let me actually go back to my ORCID record so you can you all see this. Okay, let me let me see if I could look at the public view of my ORCID record. And let me share my screen again. Okay, so this is the public view of my ORCID record. So you will see the check marks, right? The green icon with the check mark. You will see a verified email domain with lyricist.org. So I'm using my work email to verify my email domain. That's great. Now the question is that why does not automatically shows up as a trust marker in the employment section? So the difference here is that this is just an email domain. The trust marker here in the employment section, for example, this means that a system within Lyrasis pushed an employment information into my ORCID record. So since this is a particular employment record that was pushed by Lyricist to my ORCID record, it means that they verified my employment themselves. So this is basically sort of like there's a system itself pushing employment information into the ORCID record. Um, does that help by any chance, or does that need a little additional clarification?
Some additional would be where would you go to authorize, for example, Stanford to make them an authorized organization?
Correct. So you would have to go to um, basically to make the connection with your university. An example would be actually, this is a good way. If you scroll down, when we share this slide deck with you all, down below towards the end of the slide deck, you will see additional how-tos information here. And there's going to be a section on, let me see, we have funders here, and we have research organizations.
I think it's just trusted individual.
Okay, funders. Okay, funders. Okay, so let me pull up an example here. Let's go to, um, okay. All right. Essentially, researchers connect with their organization. So this is how essentially this will work. You typically your organization will have an ORCID webpage specifically for ORCID. This example is from University of Arizona. So they have an ORCID sort of like a way for their researchers to make a connection with ORCID. So their researchers, their faculty would go to this page and then they would click on create and connect ORCID IDs. So once they click on that, they would be taken to the ORCID login page. So the organization basically set this up, and then they would get to go to the ORCID login page. So once you get there, you would enter your ORCID credentials. And then they would then authorize the organization to make changes into their ORCID record, as you see here. So they're authorized here. Once they make that authorization, essentially there's the connection that happened between the organization and their ORCID ID. So once that connection happens, that organization is already authorized in your ORCID record. Now, this depends on the organization themselves. Some organization have a way that you could just make the connection. Some organizations also have an ORCID integration that automatically push employment information to your ORCID record. So it doesn't mean that it means that it really depends on the organization that you work with, whether what the capabilities are of their particular integration. So it's really the setup that they've done. It could just be that they just want you to make the connection, an integration also perhaps that they're going to push employment information in your ORCID record, or perhaps they want to push a funding information. So it really depends on how organization sets up that particular ORCID integration in their system. But essentially, what you want to do is make the connection with your organization. Also, keep in mind that not all organizations have an ORCID integration. So they may want you to have an ORCID ID, but they may not have a way for basically, they may not have an integration that is capable of making this kind of connections, but they still encourage you to make to have an ORCID ID in your organization. I hope that helps.
We do have one last question. I know we got 1 minute left if you want to quickly answer
Sure.
this. If I'm not able to find my employer in the list of trusted individuals who in the organization would be the one to register for that ORCID account. So I think they mean like who would become an ORCID member.
Right. So to get, so keep in mind that an ORCID ID is for the individual, it's for the researcher, and that's freely available to everyone. So it could be a researcher, a contributor, or you could be, even if you just work with researchers, it's always good to have an ORCID ID. So you can register for an ORCID ID freely for yourself easily. A member organization, that's really for organizations. So organizations wants to become a member, they can do so through us at arcidus@lyrasis.org. If let's say you're adding employment information in your ORCID record and you are not seeing your organization there, it probably means that your organization could potentially not have a what we're calling an organizational ID. So it could be like ROR, Research Organizational Identifier, or registry, or it could be like a Ringgold, something like that. So essentially, those kind of informations uh, is available for the drop-down menu. But if your organization does not have an organizational identifier, they will probably not show up as one of the options on that drop-down menu. However, you can always use the manual entry as well to add information in the employment informations or other affiliation information in the ORCID record. Um, so there's always a way for you to add that information in there. I hope that answers the question. All right. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. You can email us at orchidus@lyrasis.org. If you have additional questions that we didn't get to today, just feel free to email us. You can also, we will definitely share the slide deck, the recording, and additional notes from today with you all, to everyone that registered for this session. So we will do that. But again, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to just email us. And I'm also happy to stay longer on this call if you have specific things that you want to talk about. But I appreciate you all for joining us here today. Thank you. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.